because I suppose the majority of our pharmaceuticals are exported effectively to Brussels as a distribution hub for the rest of the world. Now, when you look at the employment statistics within Ireland, how many people are actually employed within the pharmaceutical sector, it's actually very, very low. And the reason for that is contract manufacturing plays a huge part, where effectively you have pharmaceutical companies setting up in the country, but contracting the manufacturing process of that outside of the country and routing the product through Ireland. So we need to be a little bit careful of overemphasising that. Much more important in terms of our domestic produce is our trade with the UK, our food, our drink. 70% of all of our food and drink exports are going to the UK and the USA. That's a simple fact.
Thank you for coming out here today. I'd just like to ask, when do you think would be a realistic time frame for this Irexit to happen, based on the fact that we're kind of lagging behind some of our European counterparts in some ways? We don't really have the groundswell is just beginning, where in other places like Britain, obviously it started 10, 20 years ago. When do you think we might actually achieve this?
Somebody once said that if in the Garden of Eden, if instead of Adam and Eve, there had been Paddy and Eve, and if Eve had come up with the apple to Paddy and said, I know you've been told by the good Lord not to bite this, but it's delicious. Paddy, being a good Irishman, would have taken the apple, looked at it, and looked around to see if anybody might see him, and he'd licked the apple. And I think maybe it's part of the colonial inheritance that John mentioned. I think we're not brave as a nation. We're great at talking brave, but we're not great at acting brave. And I think an Irish exit from the EU would be most likely only if there were a series of levers ahead of us, and might happen in the aftermath of a more generalised crisis, which could well happen in relation to the Eurozone, where the strains are building up even when Eurozone economic growth is above average. So what will things look like when growth slows down, as it inevitably must?
And it's also important, I think, this is why the movement is important, because this makes the political system a little bit more honest, because they begin to realise that actually there are votes in actually looking at this question. And that means that you actually then start to weed out those leaders who may be capable of leading Ireland into a free Ireland, free of Europe, as opposed to just managing Ireland on behalf of our outside interests. And that's fundamentally the problem. So I think it's a few years, but there's not a day to be wasted in the interim, because the moment that the next crash comes, and it will, that's the moment when all of this will go live again in the imagination of Ireland.
This lady here, please.
Hello. Just
sorry, that's what you call top marks.
As regards the EU elections that might take place in a couple of years' time, that's very important, of course. But then there's a general election going to take place, maybe in less time. It might be no harm for to have candidates for that. That's number one. But the other thing that might be on the agenda is the question of security of the state and the closure of Garda stations throughout the country, and with the resultant increase in crime. I wonder, would the panel, and maybe John particularly being from rural Ireland, would he have an opinion about the fact that these Garda stations were closed when really that they should be more open rather than closed?
Okay, well, the lady, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, how would Ireland fare economically outside of the EU? I think this point needs to be addressed, because in the UK, Remain supporting politicians have really focused on the economic argument.
Sorry. Tony, you go ahead.
Well, what is needed is, of course, a free trade agreement with the EU. We already have free trade, and that should be sustained. If there's actually no reason in principle, it seems to me, why the United Kingdom, Britain and the North of Ireland shouldn't have continual free trade with the EU. That is what they're seeking. And that would cover agriculture and produce as well, but of course, whether they actually get that is still unclear. And I think, as I said earlier on, it's only when the character of the UK-EU deal is actually seen and people know what it entails, that public opinion here will begin to sit up and ask and say, now, how does this affect us, particularly if it affects us adversely? But we do, there's no question of cutting off our trade with the EU. We do, of course, more trade outside the EU than we do with it, foreign trade, I mean. In terms of single countries, the United States of America is the most important single country market for our export industries, or foreign industries rather. And the United Kingdom, Britain and North of Ireland is the most important single country state for our domestic industries and firms. And Britain and North America, in terms of exports, Britain and North America together are about the same as the continental EEC 27 without the United Kingdom. But a sensible deal with that free trade would continue, just as no end of countries trade with the EU and don't have special agreements with it. Indeed, Japan, America, Singapore, North Korea, South Korea, Timbuktu, they all trade with the EU without without being a member of the single market or customs union. But an awful dependent upon the character of the EU-UK deal, and then we will face up to the implications of that for us.
I think if you look at, I think I agree with Tony. It very much depends on the agreement that we cast leaving, and there's no reason to believe we couldn't get a deal like that enjoyed, say, by Switzerland, where there's a lot of multinational activity in Switzerland selling into the rest of the EU. So I think our dependence on the EU is overstated, and the attractiveness of keeping trade open is understated. And I think if we look at the UK, there was all of the gloom and doom talk before Brexit, and then we had David Cameron in Davos the other week admitting that this was grotesquely overstated.
Another question, please.
So just take the man in the front here.
Hi, I'm Martin Keegan. No relation of Owen Keegan, for those of you who live in Dublin. I ran the Vote Leave franchise in Cambridge, and we had a number of problems. It was not the most popular place for leave in the UK. How would people on the panel deal with the media, and how would you deal with persuading the general public through or without the media, and how would you deal with holding your own coalition together and excluding from your coalition people who bring it into disrepute or people who just waste time? So, several questions, but practically, how are you going to do this, dealing with the realities of politics?
Well, if the issue arises, basically what needs is a movement of opinion that will express the views put forward here in the hall today, and that will gradually influence Irish life, because at the moment you hear only the Europhile voices. But my group, which produced this document that's gone around, has been legally advised there is no need for a referendum in this state to leave the EU. When we join the EU, the people altered the constitution to say the government may join. It was a permissive power, not a mandatory power. It didn't say the government must join, it's a may join. And likewise, it's open to the government to leave the EU if the government so wishes, or if they're opposite Parliament, or if a political situation comes about where an Irish government will want to leave. But strictly speaking, legally I'm informed, and I take this, I'm quite convinced that there's no need for an actual referendum in Ireland.
That wasn't really the question, though.
You said how to control different elements in a referendum.
No, how do you deal with dissension within your coalition? And
well, dissension within
how do you deal with the media?
Coalition is yet formed. There's a wide spectrum of views here today. But I think if people accept the principle that national democracy and national independence transcends the classical or traditional left and right issues, well, then there's plenty ground on which people can agree. You know, you're not for a national political party or fighting local elections or general elections, it goes throughout our policy and everything virtually.